So welcome to We're Going on a Seed Hunt, our fifth training session offered by the Community Tree Nursery Collaborative, or CTNC for short. Lovely to see you all. I'm Hilary and I work for Fellowship of the Trees and I'm the coordinator for the CTNC. So for all of you who are new to the collaborative or haven't been to one of our events before, I'll just provide a little brief introduction. It is a peer-to-peer learning network that enables community tree nurseries in the UK to share good practice and discuss common issues and challenges, and hopefully to build community between those involved. We have a private Facebook page. I've put the link at the start of the chat, and there's also a link to the form which you can use to join the CTNC and be kept up to date with all the events and other news that might be of relevance. So on to tonight's session, which is focused on how to gather different tree seeds and prepare them for planting. And just to add, if you could remain muted, we will invite questions after both our speakers have finished their talks. So I'll suggest that you use the raise hand option on the reactions sort of later on when we open the floor for questions. You're perfectly welcome to use the chat as well to write your questions in there. So on to our first speaker, who is John Stokes, Director of Tree Science and Research at the Tree Council, where he has been working on the conservation and protection of trees for over 30 years. John has written and co-written more than 10 books with the Tree Council, most recently The Tree Growers Guide. Hi John, how are you?
Hi Hilary, nice to see you. Can you hear me nicely?
Yeah, that's fine.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Yes, no, very well. Thank you. Lovely to meet you all. Lovely to meet so many people interested in trees and tree growing. And I hope I'm going to give you a little whistle-stop tour to some of the practicalities of growing trees from seed. So, you happy for me to start, Hilary? Yes? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Please, yeah.
Right.
Go ahead.
Good evening, everybody. So, my name is John. I'm Director of Tree Science and Research at the Tree Council. And the Tree Council is a national charity who work together for trees. So we have four main activities that we're involved in. We have a strand of activity based around community action. So we have lots of tree wardens and community works and grant schemes and funding that we give away for tree planting and tree works. We have a whole thread of work based around young tree champions and learning and education and partners, which we call our young tree champions. We have a whole use of science and practical science and research, which is what I'm mostly involved in, dealing with government policy, dealing with academics. We've got about £5 million worth of research going on at the moment, different ways of growing trees and how you might grow trees, including a whole strand of work on community tree nurseries and how you set them up. So it's, in that sense, it's really, really lovely to meet you all tonight. And we do a whole thread of work around partnership, because you may not have heard of us directly, but you're not necessarily supposed to. The Tree Council is the umbrella organisation for the tree sector. And our membership is the other organisations, so we don't have members of the public. But for example, Woodland Trust, National Trust, RSPB, the Wildlife Trusts are all members of the Tree Council. So are local authorities, so are community tree nurseries, so are a whole range of groups. Our job is to work through the organisations rather than necessarily straight to the public. But our collective reach is fabulous. We get into communities and young people and science and research, and particularly that thing of partnership. And the thing that you might have spotted over the years, but you may not realise it's us, is National Tree Week, which is our centrepiece for the tree year, our community-focused event. National Tree Week's been going on since 1974. And we've added other points, and the first point of the year is seed gathering season, which is where we are now, just started, and therefore it is delightful to be with you this evening. We have National Hedgerow Week, which is our second one of those ever, which is later in October. As I said, National Tree Week, which is about the planting and care of planting of trees. The Tree Care Campaign, which is about making sure once they're planted, they're looked after and protected. And then, because if you've done all that work, you might as well go out and enjoy them. We have Walk Where You Walk. It's Walk in the Woods, but sometimes we call it Walk Where You May, just to go out and have a look for trees and see what's around in your community and in your neighbourhood. But tonight, Hilary asked me to talk about growing trees from seed. And fundamentally, growing trees from seed is a very, very simple exercise. It's incredibly satisfying. It's potentially, depending upon the right tree, it's incredibly easy. Anybody can do it. And it is unbelievably satisfying to see the seeds that you've put into the ground starting to develop into young trees and to put something back into the environment. It's then about where you put them, and we'll come back to that in a bit. But there is a huge plethora of different types of seed out there at the moment. And it does start with that seed. So I apologize if this is really basic biology for all of you, but it is just worth contemplating for a second what a seed is. Because a seed is composed of a dormant embryo, a coat which protects it, the seed coat, a bit of a food store, and some of the trees may have some little cotyledons tucked inside the seed, which is what's called seed leaves. These seed leaves give the young seedling a bit of energy just after it emerges, before it actually has a chance to grow any proper leaves. And the most famous of those is beech, and the little beech seedling at the bottom there confuses almost everybody in the spring, because you get these weird little seedlings with big leaves that start developing, but they are beech seedlings. So the seed is a really complex entity, and therefore it needs a bit of handling carefully so that you protect the embryo, you work out how to break that seed coat, you make sure that the food is appropriate, and you give the little seed a chance. And it really starts in spring. So I'm sure you know, but there are two basic types of trees. There are monoecious trees and dioecious trees. Monoecious trees are trees that have both flowers on one tree. So that means that every tree produces seed of some sort. Hazel is the classic. You're all always aware of the big catkins, the male catkins. But if you look very carefully, there is a little tiny flower, the female flower, which most people don't spot. That little tiny flower is what gets pollinated by the pollen from the catkins, and that's what develops into the nut. And so monoecious trees have both types of flower on the one tree. So that means that every one of those trees flowers. They have slightly complicated breeding systems to avoid self-pollination. They don't really want to pollinate. The male pollen doesn't want to land on their own females. So they come out at slightly different times. So you get this long season where the pollen blows, spreads, tries to get to a neighboring tree. But if all else fails, sometimes the male flower can produce pollen that lands on the female, but they try to avoid that. They try to outcross. And that's the wind-pollinated monoecious tree. There are also insect-pollinated monoecious trees. And this is where you have a flower, a tree flower. Every tree has a flower. It's just you may not spot them. These are the obvious flowers with petals and showy bits. And on these you have the males and the female bits, the anther, the stigma, contained within the one flower. And these plants require something else to move the pollen around. And that's usually a bee. So again, you get lots of fruit on almost every tree. Apples, pears, cherries, plums, dogwoods. These are all trees that are monoecious and insect pollinated. So understanding that helps. Basically, wind pollinated, insect pollinated, big flowers, both trees on both sexes on one tree. There are, however, other trees that aren't, and these are called dioecious trees. And this is where you need a male and a female tree. And if I had a pound for every time somebody says, "Why has my holly not got any fruit on it this year?" I say, well, it's never going to have fruit on it because that's a male tree. And you can't get fruit on a male tree. So that element of some of the trees have male and female trees, and if it's a male tree, it will never produce a flower. unless, because there's always something, it's an ash. And an ash can be a male tree one year, female tree the next year, and the next year it might be both. It is one of the few things that completely swaps around in any given year. Nobody knows how or why, but ash, when it's flowering, can, as I say, be a male tree, a female tree, or both. Really complicated, but one of those curiosities of nature. So once you then get the flowers pollinated, you get some seed. And one of the things that we had to do 20 years ago when I started on a lot of this, there was some very complicated Forestry Commission guidance on how you processed seeds. It was really, really complicated. And we tried to make it simple. So we started to look at how you could divide seeds up into groups. And so we decided that we could divide seeds up roughly into 4 main groups: cones, winged seeds, fruits, and nuts. And we've added subsequently pods, which are the leguminous trees like laburnum, for example. But these 4 processes, these 4 main processes, became the heart of all the stuff we've produced since on how to grow trees from seed. So you start with one of these types, the berries, for example. And here we have 3 very classic berries: hawthorn, rowan, yew. Yew is not technically a berry, although everybody thinks of it. Yew is actually a cone, and that's why, although we call them berries, it is a simplification of some complicated science. You treat it as a berry, but actually it's really a cone. But hey, nobody needs to know that. As far as I'm concerned, for the purposes of this, it's a berry, and that's how you treat it. We'll come back to how you treat it in a minute. The second are the wing seeds. These are things like ash and sycamore, field maple. And wing seeds are another whole group of seeds that you deal with differently. So we have berries, wing seeds, nuts, the obvious ones, and some of the not so obvious ones, but are treated the same. So we've clumped a lot of nuts together: hazel, walnut, horse chestnut, and other things like oak, which is not technically a nut, but again, for the purposes of this, we call it a nut. And then cones, mostly on conifers, but not always, because the older species have cones, even though it's a broadleaf. As I said, it's complicated, which is why we had to simplify it. And giving these 4 broad categories, nuts, cones, wing seeds, berries, meant that we could put trees into different groups so that you can process them. And this is the point of all this. It's not about a hard science to be able to ensure that you know which is which. It's about the processing of them. And I produced a book about 20 years ago called The Good Seed Guide, which was taking this stuff further and working out the process. How do you process these seeds? So the first thing with a nut is very, very simple. You chuck it in a bucket of water. And if it floats, you chuck it away. And if it sinks, it's good and you can plant it. And really, that's all the processing you need for nuts, because they are really very, very simple. If they float, forget them. If they're sinkers, plant them. And that sounds really, really simple. But if I tell you I bought 10,000 acorns from a commercial nursery one year, and we poured them in a bucket, and of the 10,000, only 6 sank, it meant that only 6 were good. And that's what you need to know. You need to know which one the good ones are, because you could have planted 9,994 of those and you'd have been completely wasting your time. So what this does is it gives you a way of separating out the good from the bad. Wing seeds, again, simple. You just break them in half. They don't like trying to germinate in pairs. So with wing seeds, which are often in pairs, you literally just break them apart. Cones, stick them in a bag. Leave them by the fire, leave them on the mantelpiece, leave them on the sunny window, leave them there for a while, and eventually the edges of the cone will part, and then you shake them in the bag, and that releases all the seeds. The thing is, it sometimes takes a very long time. I mean, I've had some for years that have been in the bag, but eventually they get to the point where they ripen and open. And the most complicated one are the berries, because all the berries are designed to be passed through the gut of a bird or an animal, and to have the flesh, the berry, taken off to reveal the seed in the middle. And so we had to come up with a process that enabled us to separate the flesh from the fruit, because they will not germinate with the flesh on. The flesh actually inhibits the seed from developing. So in the end, the best method we came up with is the highly technical potato masher. A bit of a bowl of water, a potato masher, and give them a good mashing in your bowl, and the seeds will then separate from the flesh. And you want to try and get as much of the flesh off as you can, because any little bit actually inhibits the development, the growth of that seed. So that's the first bit. You collect your seed and you process it. You use those 4 simple techniques, and then your seed is ready for the next bit. And the next bit is stratification. This is a big word, posh word, for basically storing it somewhere safe in the cold over the winter. You can do it in a whole range of ways. You can store it in pots. You can make proper stratification mediums, which are often a mixture of sort of peat-free compost and a bit of grit, so that it doesn't hold water too much. You can do it in large volumes like buckets. You can do it in dustbins, or you can do it in seed pots. And this just gets the seed through the winter. What happens in a seed is there's a natural inhibition. The seed doesn't want to ripen in September. So what it needs is some cold. It needs the winter. It needs the winter to tell the seed, it's been winter, it's warming up, now I'm going to grow. And stratification does that. You store it in a pot, you keep it safe over the winter. Winter happens, the seed then starts to germinate in the spring. The other way of doing it, if you've got very supportive partners, or you live on your own, whichever, is stick it in the fridge or the freezer. It requires a certain amount of sort of support from your wife, in my case, if she comes home and finds I filled the freezer up with all sorts of different things, seeds, which I have done. It can speed up the process and give you a false winter. What you don't want to do is bring the seeds out too early. So you leave them in the fridge or the freezer over winter, keep them cold, and then you spread them out. And what you then do in the spring is you sow them exactly the same as you would with any other plant. There are all sorts of ways of doing this. You can sow them in pots, you can sow them in milk cartons, you can sow them in root trainers, you can sow them in a seed bed. And the basic rule of thumb is you want to plant the seed in the soil about as deep as it is wide. So you just plant them below the surface. Acorns go down a bit deeper, birch goes just literally on the surface. And what will then happen is that in the spring, they will germinate. And once they're germinated, they start to grow. And eventually in your tree nursery, in your pot, in your flower, you can start to think about planting them out. And it really is as simple as that. I've grown hundreds, nay, thousands of different types of tree and individual trees at home, just using those simple rules, just using that simple process to gather your seed, to process it, to stratify it, to sow it, and then to plant it out. And there's lots of information on the Tree Council website to help you with all this, because it's seed gathering season. But we've just updated the Good Seed Guide with a new version, which we've written over the last 6 months, which is called the Tree Growers Guide. This is formally for sale at the moment. There will be on the 16th of October a new website, I think, called the treegrowersguide.org.uk, and that will have a free downloadable version if you don't want to hold one, and lots of other information will be there about how to grow trees from seed. We will certainly spread that to Hilary and let her pass it around the network so everybody can get it for free if they want to. Me, I like to have a book in my hand, so that's why we've printed a few hard copies, because I like books in my hand. But as I say, there will be a version that you can download if you want to. And the new version of the book takes the illustrations, takes the processes, takes the story a bit and updates it over 20 years ago when I did it last. The fundamentals, however, are pretty similar. you still collect and sow and grow and plant. And that process exists with all the trees. And we've just updated the species list and given you some new information about things that you may not have tried before. Indian bean tree I collected yesterday, which we're processing at the moment. And we've also included a whole new section on how to set up a community tree nursery, how to get trees growing as a community, working with More Trees, which is a fabulous charity down in Devon that set up a community tree nursery. And Adam's produced a lot of the content for this alongside the good seed stuff. And there's all sorts of information in there about how to lay up a nursery, how to set up a nursery, what you need, and how you can move that step further into something more than just growing a few seeds, but growing them at scale, growing them across for larger scale use. So please do either have a look at the book or wait for the free download, and hopefully there will be lots of new information that gives you some information and some ideas on what you might be able to do. The last couple of slides before I finish. I guess the first question is, why should we grow trees from seed? Well, the answer is, somebody asked me this on, I think it was Gardener's World. I think I'm on Gardener's World this weekend. Not Gardener's World, Gardener's Question Time this weekend. And they asked, why bother? Why? I mean, doesn't nature do enough? Well, the answer is, if you're a birch tree, you produce 1 million seeds. You expect only 5% of them will actually germinate. So there's 909, I can't even bother doing the maths, but a vast number of seeds that will get lost, get wasted. Collecting those and giving them a bit of a helping hand can just improve the number of trees that we get. And this year's mast year for acorns is quite phenomenal. So there are millions of acorns out there, and acorns are one thing that cannot be stored. We don't know how to store them. So the only way we're going to get them to grow is to plant them, to stick them in the ground. And so, it's about doing something useful, local, and advantageous. There are obviously things that you should and shouldn't do. You shouldn't climb things. You shouldn't get up into trees. You should look to collect from where you can stand on the ground. The seeds are better in paper bags than plastic bags because they don't rot and they don't become full of fungi and all sorts of things. But it is a relatively risk-free exercise collecting seeds, unless you decide, as some of the professionals do, to start shooting the seeds out of the tree. That becomes quite exciting. I wouldn't recommend it, but that's what they do. And then you have to cope with the vagaries of seeds. So spring frosts kill off all the flowers. So you get a year where there is literally no seed. Or you get, like this year, unbelievably wonderful mast years with thousands, millions of seeds that are there. So there's a bit of glut and a bit of famine, but you just have to know your trees, go look and collect the right ones for that year. So I'm conscious that I'm out of time, and just a few sort of last things, if you're planning to collect seeds, just remember that legally all seeds are the property of the owner, and you should check before you go rampaging across somebody's land collecting their seeds. They aren't free, they are the property of somebody. So talk to them. Almost nobody minds, but you need to ask. You should know what you're gathering. Some of the berries are poisonous and are easily confused, and you don't want to be getting kids picking yew berries and thinking they're something edible. So you need to be a bit careful on the poisonous front. Don't ever gather more than you need, because it'll just go to waste, and it's better that we try and leave it in situ. Take care not to damage any of the trees as you gather the seeds. Don't break bits off, don't snap stuff out. You don't need to. Pick them off the ground, pick them up nearby. And as I say, just keep safety in mind. Gather your seeds from the ground or from branches that you can easily reach. As I say, it's not dangerous, it's not rocket science, but it is desperately good fun. So thank you for listening. I hope that's given you a little flavour of how you might do some seed gathering, why you might do some seed gathering. But in the end, it's about growing your next generation of trees. And that's what we're all about. So from us at the Tree Council to you at the Community Tree Nurseries, thank you for your time. Thank you for your effort. And hopefully this was some interest. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, John. That was wonderful. And just to reaffirm that this is being recorded and it will be available on the Fellowship of the Trees YouTube channel this week. And I'll also send you a link as well in a follow-up email to the recording. So yeah, thank you so much, John. So I'm going to be handing over to our second speaker shortly. I'm just checking that you're there first, Sandra, before I introduce you.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's beautiful. So
Great.
I just wanted to check you were there before I
That's okay.
introduce you. So Sandra joins us from the Bath area, and she is the Community Tree Nursery Development Manager at More Trees Baines, which is Bath and North East Somerset. And she has worked in the community sector for over 20 years. And I believe this is your second seed hunting season for you there. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just hand over to you. Sandra will talk about her experience with from a community tree nursery perspective of seed gathering, and then when you've finished, we can open the floor for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Hilary and the collaborative for inviting us to come and talk today. So yes, my slides are up there being done by somebody else. So I've never done it this way before. So presumably I just say next slide, please. So just as an introduction then, yeah, as Hilary said, it's just our second year of collecting seeds. So we're real newbies at this. I'd never done it before. And in fact, none of the people around me had ever done it before. So we just started by gathering as much information as we could. And the tree guide, seed guide that John's been going through was our little Bible. It really got us going. We visited More Trees Devon. We visited Special Branch, both brilliant days out, learned absolutely loads. A lot of networking, and this collaborative has been brilliant as well. Training and open space sessions. So we just kind of try to hoover up as much information as we can. So I'm just going to give a quick summary of how we've gone about things in the last year, and we've started again this year in terms of seed collecting. So as I said, first of all, we wanted to kind of dig a little bit deeper into this idea of local provenance. We wanted to collect local seed for growing local trees, but we thought it'd be good to know what the research base for that was. So we asked somebody that's doing an environmental degree and had access to various sort of academic research and things to do a kind of review of what was out there for us, and it just reconfirmed really that local provenance is important. So it is worth collecting tree seed locally, but also equally important was genetic diversity of seed. So that suggested we should look at collecting from lots of different locations, which is what we've now set about doing. So it kind of informed the way we went about collecting from multiple locations. And we've discovered that's also important in terms of collecting a diversity of species. Some woods are sort of typically dominated by one or two or three different species, and there may not be much seed from the variety of species you want to collect from. If you go to reserves and things that are managed by wildlife trusts and things, they tend to be more diverse because they're managed specifically for that. We also developed like a bit of a hierarchy. We wanted to avoid, if we could, collecting seed from plantations. We wanted to ideally have seed that was from trees that were naturalized. So just making the seed itself even more adapted to local conditions. So we started our approach by looking at ancient semi-natural woodland, which I'll come on to in a minute. And also established hedgerows, established hedgerows and established woodlands as well. So the next slide, please. Thank you. Oh, that's the last slide. Yeah, that's it. So yes, we wanted to also pick woodlands where people could actually join us to do the collecting. So accessibility for communities was really important as well. We're Bath and North East Somerset, so we've picked woodlands that are in a variety of different locations around Bath and North East Somerset, because we understand that some people are not able to travel very far. We do offer lifts at the moment as well for people that can't get there on public transport. I've just mentioned there as well, we obviously focus on woodlands where we're able to get permissions. So we do have permission from the landowners to collect the seed in all the different woodlands. So we started by trying to find our local woodlands. We obviously started with our OS map. I'm a great fan of maps. So the next slide, please. So I just took my local map really, and I sort of cross-referenced it with what we call the magic map. I think other people might have, it's a sort of national thing. It shows you ancient semi-natural woodlands or designated woodlands on there, and so I just cross-referenced that onto my OS map, and that's how I started like organising stuff, organising seed collecting events.
Sorry, can I just interrupt? Taliesin, could you possibly put these slides on screen share, please? Because we can't see them at the moment.
I can do that. That might be an issue with people's viewing. If everyone can hear me, if you go to the top right of your screen and you press where it says view speaker, you should be able to see the slides alongside. If that doesn't work, just give me another text in the chat and I can share them myself.
Okay, yeah, I can. It's not the whole screen, but can see them a bit clearer. Is everyone else able to see them? It's just smaller than the regular screen share, but they're more visible now.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't affect the size, but I can screen share, but I'll let you make that call, Hilary. If you want me, I can. It might take a minute for me to switch over.
How do you feel, Sandra? Would you like...
I don't mind if people can't see me and can see the slides. So, I mean, go for it. If people,
yeah,
that's...
I'll keep the slides up then. Okay, I'll pull you off. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, hopefully that's better. I can see it a bit better. So could you just click the slides, Taliesin? Next click. Thank you. Okay. Sorry, slightly distracted then. So, okay, so yeah, basically, we a bit like John was saying, in order to get permission, we sort of developed our own little mini good practice collecting guide, and I think the landowners liked that. Just explained that we're not going to trample everywhere. We'll use the footpaths. We don't collect an enormous amount of seed, and we're quite careful. So roughly 10% maximum from each tree. We use a kind of foraging approach. So take a bit from a tree and then move on to the next one. So we collect from lots of trees and encourage people to be really careful about where they're walking, and also just asking people to clean their boots before they come on the walk, and then to clean them after they've left the walk and left the seed collecting, so they're not carrying pathogens and things from one woodland to the next. Next slide, please. So which species did we collect? Sorry, next slide. We basically started by using the National Vegetation Classification for this area, which just tells you what native trees are naturally occurring in your area. So they call out...
If you're leaving the train here, please.
Sorry.
With you, and do take care of stepping down onto the platform.
Who is that?
I don't know. Somebody's on a train, I think.
Somebody's on a train, so if they just need muting.
Okay.
So yes, that's I think that's 20 odd species, maybe 26 species, I think. So we picked those kind of naturally occurring native trees. We also, as you might recognize on this bench here, the one in the foreground. We've picked out 2 or 3 others that we want that weren't on that list that we know occur in the area, and we wanted to grow them. So we wanted to grow sweet chestnut because obviously it's a food source, and so that was another and potentially quite an easy one to grow. So we have been growing sweet chestnut as well. So the other thing that we've been looking at, but we're still not quite sure what to do about yet, and maybe John might help us with that a bit, but obviously we understand about climate change, and so we're talking about whether or not we should be getting some seed from further south, and also starting to collect seed from different types of trees that might be climate resilient, and still able to sort of withstand rising temperatures in 50, 60, 70 years. Okay, next slide. So yes, how do we go about it? I think the key things for us when we go out collecting is that the seed has to be ripe. The kind of little click buttons aren't working, but in the background there, I don't know whether you can see that, but there's flowering and seed collecting times. That's I've taken that from the BTCV seed collecting guide. That's something you probably can just get on the internet, and that was just quite a useful table because it gives you a list of a lot of the trees that we're collecting from and tells you when they're going to be ripe. So we started using that as a guide. I mean, in a nutshell, I've got to stop saying that. If the berries are very squishy, then you'll be able to get the seed out and they're ripe. So that's fairly easy. So then with things like the nuts, for example, the hazelnuts, which are pretty much over in this area now, they start to go a little bit brown, and then you can pop them off the bracts really easily. The same with the acorns. They're either on the ground or you can pop them off the little cups really easily. At least we think that's means they're ripe, and I'm quite happy to be corrected on that. So things like when you've got on the top right there, we've got some Gelder rose, and we think the seeds, when they go pink, are probably ripe. Generally speaking, for example, crab apples in the bottom there, their seed inside needs to be brown. So if they're not quite brown, then probably not quite ripe. And we don't really know how important it is to have sort of optimum ripeness, but I mean, we're just sort of doing our best really, and trying to get them as ripe as possible before they get eaten. Just avoid collecting or discard anything with holes in because they've got beetles in or whatever. And then viability, for example, with the beech, you can test a percentage of them on site. I know Chris from Special Branch suggested that, and there's no point in collecting lots of seeds if it's just not viable. So for example, with the beech, you can just take those little nuts out and squeeze them. If they're really spongy, then there's no nuts inside. If they're hard and you can't squash them, then they are viable. And then you might want to check a few, and if you're getting them all empty, you might decide to try a different tree or come back later in the season. And that's generally speaking, we do check some of them on site if we don't want to collect loads of dud seed. So yeah, I think those are the main things we think about when we collect seed and how we collect them. So next slide. So what do we do with the seeds after collection? I mean, most of the seeds, the berries and things, we tend to collect them. Like today, we've started just collecting them in plastic bags. So everybody has a big plastic bag, and they put all the seeds together unless they look very similar. So most of them are quite distinct. So you can just chuck them all in together, and we bring them back to our hub where we sort them all out and then process them. So the nuts we don't want them to dry out, so we tend to put them in compost straight away until they can be properly planted in root trainers. We use root trainers in our central nursery, and then as you can see, we tend to use things like they're rolling pins. We found they're quite useful, but in the end, a lot of people just use their hands to squash the berries and get the little nutlets out or the little seeds out and things. So yes, when you're collecting, just make sure you know what you're going to do with them afterwards, because it's quite a job. So you'll need help and you'll need to be organised and have a bit of equipment. It's easy to do, and you don't need much equipment, you know, buckets, bits of wood, you know, it's not complicated, but you do need hands on deck to do it, otherwise your seed will just go to rot and you've wasted the seed, as John says. No point in having it unless you're going to do something with it. So next slide. So yeah, essentially with the berries, they're all squashed and all the flesh taken off, washed as clean as we can get them. We put them in stratification mixture, and we do use the fridge, so we put most of our berries in the fridge. And then with the nuts, so the beech nuts, the hazelnuts and the acorns, we plant them straight into root trainers, and then they go outside in the nursery. Yeah, so we have cages on all our little seedlings and all our seeds that are sown. We just constructed them with very fine mesh and wood, very similar to what's shown in the tree growers guide from More Trees Devon. So that's really my slide. So the last slide just says challenges and lessons. I think the key lessons for us have been that there's not a lot of seed available in the woods where we are. Not if you want to go into the woods proper. We tend to find that the edges are better for collecting seed, you know, the rides through the woodland are better for collecting seed. Once you get deep into the woodlands, you tend to have, especially depending on the way it's managed, but you often have, you know, much higher canopies, and it's just not possible to reach the seed unless it's falling to the floor and hasn't been eaten. We feel as though our woodlands are not in great shape. You know, there's not a big diversity of species there. So we do have to go to lots of different locations to collect the seed that we want. And so I think we've got about 30 different locations at the moment to collect seed from. Prepare for your group collecting sessions. You know, this is logistics, but it's just so important if you want to involve other people. You're basically leading a group into the woodland. So the best thing to do is to go to the woods first to find out if there's any seed and where the seed is. Otherwise, the first year, you know, I'd be wandering around the wood feeling really stressed because I had a group of really keen people and there's no seed, and it's just awkward, and it makes it, you know, it's not as exciting or as interesting for people. So this year we're much ready, and we've got our kits. We take secateurs to take off, if we think it's easier or less damaging, we use them to take off the little sort of clusters of berries. We take our trusty seed guide or tree growers guide with us for tree ID. And yeah, we limit the numbers generally, so we probably have 6 or 7 people at the most, and be ready to process them, know what you're going to do, and then be flexible when you go out collecting. I mean, really what we're doing now is just collecting what we find that's ripe, as long as it's a native tree species, so, or a native tree species. So don't be too fixed on what you think you're going to collect. Just collect what you can. Anyway, that's my little chat. So
thank you very much, Sandra. Some lovely tips there. I'm sorry about the slide issue, but you adapted very well. So I'd like to invite anybody to ask a question. Who would like to ask the first question? If you'd like to use the raised hand option in reactions, that would be good, since there's quite a large group here tonight. Help us to focus on who needs to ask a question. Carol Davis?
Yes, I don't know if I missed it, but do you crack the nuts or do you plant them still in their hard cases?
So that, I'm sorry, you are happy with that one, Sandra, or should I do that one? So it depends on the nut. Some of them you, for example, horse chestnut, the obvious one, has a green husk around the outside brown nut. You don't plant it with the husk on. You split out the brown nut from the middle. But what you don't do is, once you've got the brown nut, you don't then split that before you put it in the ground. That nut is there to protect it, get it through the winter. So it does depend very much on the seed, but most of the husks are green, and most of the nuts usually are some form of brown. So no, generally speaking, don't break them apart.
Okay, I was thinking more of hazelnuts really.
Hazelnuts you plant solid. They are designed to go in the ground just as a solid hazelnut. So just put them in the ground.
And if I can ask again, what about things like plum stones, the plum family?
Plum stones you have to get the flesh off.
Yeah.
Plum stones really do. You have to get so much of the flesh off that you almost got to scrub them sometimes. But once you've got it off, that stone in the middle, that you just plant it and leave it intact. You don't want to break it or crack it.
Thank you.
My line's a bit unstable, Hilary. So if I suddenly crash out, which I just did a second ago, I see Adam's here. As I said, the co-author of the book with me on the stuff. So if I drop out, I'm sure Adam can answer things. If I happen to just drop out,
Sure.
apologies.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Okay, Mark, did you have a question?
Yeah, it was about stratification, really. Sandra mentioned that putting them in the fridge. Is that enough to make a short winter in the fridge, or are you still having to go through the traditional process of putting them in a mix of sand and peat outside over the winter?
I don't know if I can fully answer that question, but not everybody does put stuff in the fridge, and they have quite a lot of success. So you can try both. And it's just that we started putting stuff in the fridge, and when we put it in the fridge, we do put it in a stratification mixture, which keeps it moist. So you need to check on them now and then to make sure they're not drying out. So and what happens is they actually chit in the fridge. So I wouldn't have expected that to happen. I would have thought they needed to come out into the light and the warmth and things, and that would kickstart the germination. But weirdly, they actually chit in the fridge. So once you know they're chitting and a certain amount of them are chitting, you can then start sowing them. But I know Chris from Special Branch, they don't use fridges, they don't have access to electricity, and I don't know what More Trees Devon does now, but I think they didn't use the fridge for a long time. But
no, that's great. I'm interested because I collect apple sign wood, and I put that in the fridge, but I don't need the fridge until April for that, March or April. So it might be a good idea to start looking at for chitting the seed as well. Thank you.
Double purpose fridge, that's always an advantage.
Thank you. Paul, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me okay?
We can,
Yeah.
Paul.
Oh, good. So I've got a couple of questions. Is that allowed, or just one?
Yeah, if they're quite brief ones.
Yeah, quite quick.
Yeah.
So right, maybe one for John then first. So do you know which trees are potentially climate resilient? So, there's particular sort of types that we might need to be looking at.
So that's a complicated question. Sorry, was it Paul?
Yeah.
It's a complicated question, Paul. So there's two aspects to that. There's a number of different aspects to that. There's the first is that species that we've got here naturally, the native species and others that are growing here anyway. And the question then is the seed of those trees suitable for a changing climate? So it depends who you listen to. There's one school of thought that says we should be introducing genetics from seed from further south in Europe. There's another school of thought that says that our seed has enough, horrible phrase, genetic plasticity, the ability to cope with all the things that nature will throw at them over time. I think both are valid arguments, both are valid things worth contemplating. But you have to be careful if you're importing seed, from say France, that you're not importing pests and diseases. But certainly, if you live in Yorkshire, it might be worth collecting seed now from Hampshire, for example, because that movement of the in terms of the species might be climate resilient, well, that's when you start thinking about introducing new species to the mix, starting to think about different species that you might bring into the country. Again, it has a set of problems and issues and conundrums. And it has to be the right tree for the right place. So holm oak, for example, is starting to spread along the south coast of the UK where I live. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is still up for discussion. But it is spreading, it is growing, it's producing trees. If you're after climate absorption, then it works. But if you're after biodiversity, then it doesn't. So it's a really complicated, it's a simple question to ask. It's a really complicated one to answer, I'm afraid.
Right. Okay, that's fine. I just thought there was some kind of top 3 trees we should be considering or something like that, you know.
Well,
obviously not.
I still think our natives are worth exploring. If you're looking at something gives you a bit of climate resistance. I like walnuts. I think walnuts are lovely trees. So the occasional walnut scattered around, they grow really well. They have some biodiversity, but they also provide a lot of food for animals. So I quite like a walnut if I'm going non-native.
Hard to get in there, I've found. I've got a walnut tree about 100 yards from me, and I've been, monitoring it. Went on holiday, came back, none left.
Yeah.
So it's timing, I think, with walnuts.
Always the timing. Always the timing.
So can I sneak in a quick one, Sandra, then? About collecting locations. So Sandra, so you mentioned you collect from a few different locations in terms of, you get some berries from one tree and then a bit more, say, rowan from another tree down the road. Do you not have to note the locations of the trees you're collecting from? Because that was one thing I always thought I had to do. So which meant that I would just basically collect from one tree, because the admin and the paperwork would be a nightmare if I collected from about 20 different ones. So does it not really matter?
Well, we're not yet done the application form for forest reproductive material, which it might be what you're talking about. We just haven't had time to do it yet. But we keep a record of where all the seed comes from, not individual trees. But we keep a record of, like, if we're collecting seed in Folly Farm or Folly Wood, then we would make a note of that, and then that label or provenance goes with the tree right through the growing process. So when somebody receives that tree, they'll know that tree, whatever it is, comes from Folly Farm.
Right.
But I'm not aware of there being any kind of requirement. Even somebody else can answer that. But I think you can apply for something called forest reproductive material, which is advisable because it kind of confirms that you're collecting, your trees have got local provenance. But I don't know what the paperwork is relating to that. I'd be surprised if it was a tree by tree thing, though. I can't.
Right.
That sounds very onerous.
No, okay. That's maybe I just got the wrong end of the stick. I just sort of thought we had to pin down the individual tree.
It does genuinely matter if you are starting to think about selling them. Then you have to go through the process of getting your FRM's paperwork, but that's not quite the case if you're just growing on a small scale and using them in your local community. It's still useful to know where they've come from, just so that you know where they've come from, but it's not a prerequisite.
But I can note the area then they've come from rather than the actual tree. So I'll do that in future. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Adam,
did you want to add anything to that at all?
Only just to say that if you were going down the FRM route, then and you've applied and you've got your supplier number, then no, they're not expecting you to do it on a tree by tree basis. If you were collecting it from a wood, they just expect you to give a grid reference for the center of that wood. If you're collecting from a neighborhood of streets in an urban area, I suspect they'd expect the same, just drop a centroid sort of in the center of that area that you're collecting from. So they're not right down to individual trees at all.
Okay, great. Thank you.
It's Adam and I haven't seen each other for ages. Have I noticed you've just grown a beard?
I've lengthened my beard. It's my winter period.
It's lovely to see you, my friend.
Thank you. Can we go over to Janet now for a question? You there, Janet?
Yes, I am. Sorry, just on mute myself. I wanted to ask about, what do you mix with when you're doing nuts? Because you need to generate those skins on them. So do you mix something with the mix to help that process? Like manure or pine rock? I hear, you know, people use different things.
I genuinely don't know the answer to that, having never been asked that question before. I've never bothered with anything particularly. It's generally the soil or the stratification medium has done the job, but I'm prepared to learn if there's something I don't know out there. So if anybody else knows, or if anybody else has got a tip on that front, that's not something I've ever done before, but it doesn't mean it's not right.
Okay.
Anybody else? No, that's a new one. That's a new one on most of us, I think.
Yeah, I was just going to say, what's the objective? To try and get the shell off the nuts? Is that?
Yeah, just to break it down, to help it to break down.
No, we've never done anything other than put them in a mix, as you say, of sort of some we put in a coir mix, some we put in a sharp sand and compost mix, but we've never done anything other than
nothing special. Okay.
No. But send us the recipe in case you've got some master stroke that we've never heard of, and it makes all the difference. And I'm sure Adam and I'll test it and see if we get any better results.
Okay, we'll do. Yeah, I did a course at Sparshall, and that was one of the things that they recommended that you mix. But you know,
I never say never. The thing that I am always learning is that the old books, the old techniques, we've often forgotten some of these things. And I discovered we did a planting of a hedgerow this year on a bank. We dug out a soil bank and planted on the top of the hedgerow, and I absolutely bet my colleagues that they would all be dead by this end of this drought. And the best trees that we've grown this year on that experiment was on the bank. Wow. I then looked it up in the 18th century books, and all the 18th century books said plant your hedges on a bank. You know, a 3 foot by 3 foot pile of soil. So there's an awful lot of stuff that we've forgotten. So I never take anything for granted. So send us the recipe and we'll see if we can come up with something brilliant.
No problem. Thanks.
There used to be a product called Garotta, which was a compost accelerator. And when added to the stratification mix, it aided the hard coats breakdown.
Is that Anthony?
Yes.
Hi, Anthony.
Hello, John. Good to see you. Yeah.
Okay, so that's a new one.
Anything which performs that sort of function of accelerating composting would probably have the same effect.
Okay.
I know Yarrow does. I know Yarrow is a natural composter.
Well, there you go. So we learn something new every night. That's what makes this all such interesting fun, really.
Right.
Thank you both.
Thank you. That absolutely. So Terence, Terence, you got a question?
Yes, sorry. Thanks very much. Good to speak to you all. I'm here up in Scotland and I'm growing trees for the local community group, 40 different species, and I've been experimenting, and your talk's very good. I was a student at Kew centuries ago, but I've learned quite a few things about dormancy and stuff, and I even germinated some Cornus Cusa chilensis, much to my surprise, by stratification in the fridge. Now, the point in the question, thank you for asking me, is nobody's mentioned anything about the soil once the seedlings are planted. I mean, commercial compost seemed very heavy and very wet. Is there a sort of general compost mix which would suit most indigenous species? Or, you know, is it genus dependent?
There is definitely some genus dependence, you know, and species dependence. I mean, the classic one is the downy and silver birch. You know, downy birch likes dry, sandy soils. Silver birch likes wet, claggy soils. You know, they will both occur on either of the other, but they don't like it very much. So I think it depends when you're planting out what your basic soil is. You know, sorry, not your basic, but your natural soil is like, and if it needs a bit of help, then a bit of compost of either commercial or home produced will always help. But I think there's an element of you know, there's an element of when you're looking after young trees of being too tender with them and making them so sensitive and looking after them so nicely that when you stick them out in the harsh outside world, they just don't make it, because they're not used to coping with the things that life throws at them. So I've always been a bit sort of hard on them and just chuck them in anything really and see what happens. But I'm not trying to do it on scale. I'm not trying to do it as, for example, Adam does, where you're trying to actually grow thousands of trees in once. So I'm sure somebody else will have a different opinion.
Thank you very much. It was very informative.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. David Powell.
Sorry, just to.
Oh, sorry. Is that Adam?
Yeah, got it, Adam. Yeah.
I was just going to say, for us, what we found over the last few years is the difference between growing them bare root in the soil and growing them in pots or in cells. And the mix is more important when it comes to what's going into the cells, because we've tried different things of actually digging out soil and using that and putting them into the cells. No, it makes hard and just it's impossible, and the trees suffer. We've tried mixing it with organic homegrown compost. Again, not found that very effective because there's been very low nutritional values in it. And what we've actually gone to is a commercial compost, which is by Melcourt, and they do lots of different composts, and we use Silver Grow and a nursery mix. But that is specifically for growing them in root trainers and small cells. Bare earth stuff, we operate, I suppose, like an allotment. You know, you just use bits of grass clippings, bits of your own home composting, you know, a bit of a no dig, and you know, keep mixing that into the earth. If you've got very heavy soils, then obviously putting sharp sands and that to lighten the soil. If you've got very dry soils, you put in a lot more organic waste. Mushroom compost is fantastic, things like that. So it just depends how you're wanting to grow it. But definitely growing them in pots or in cells, you need a good open compost, you know, that's got good airflow within it as well. But you may want to add in some vermiculite or perlite as well for some water retention, and you may even need to start adding feeds as well. It can be organic feeds, or so, because pots dry out very quickly, and go with that. And you know, if you've got trees growing around you, you could always sweep up those leaves as well and put those into your compost to sort of add mycorrhiza, fungi and things like that. But it's a bit of an unproven science in that one.
Have you had any, our friend in Scotland, have you had any success with aspen?
I'll be honest, I've been cheating. I've been taking root cuttings from roots. We've planted quite a number, and I find it's much quicker. I haven't tried seeds, but I'd say the most success I had, to my astonishment, was this Cornus Cousa. I had about 30 seedlings pop up after about a year, and I'd stratified them in the wife's fridge, and I was so chuffed. It was like finding a new baby, because I had no idea that'd be successful, and I was able to pop them on and sell them at the local. I know they're not native, but they're a fabulous garden tree. But no, not aspen. Why do you ask about aspen?
Oh, it's just that aspen from seed is a really tricky thing, and if you were to get it to go, I imagine Scotland would be one of the places that it would actually work.
No, I tend to cheat. Same with populus as well. I've been using cuttings, but yeah, I'm going to have to go now, can I thank you very much for your talk?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for listening on Sandra and my behalf.
Thank you, both of you. Very interesting.
Can we go over to David now for your question? David Powell? You just need to unmute yourself, David.
Hi, good evening. One for Sandra, and in fact one of the previous speakers mentioned as well. What precisely do you mean by root trainers?
Hi, yes, I mean a root trainer, there was one of my slides had a photo of it. Somebody might be able to get a photo of it, but basically they're just quite deep little cells. So we have trays, and there's like 32 pods in each tray, and they call them root trainers just because they're quite a deep pot. And
Okay.
that just means you've got a fair, by the time it goes out into the beds, you've got a fairly deep or planted out. Some people grow them for like more than a year, I think, in those root trainers, and then they've got a good solid root, a root ball on them, which gives them a better chance, I think, when they go out and planted out.
That's good. That makes sense. So basically deep cells. What I've tried, and it seems to work, is been lucky enough to get hold of some offcuts of drain pipe, 4-inch drain pipe. So they're 2 foot long, so the seedling in the top, and you actually do get this terrific root development until they're big enough to sort of go out in the wide world. But
no, just as good.
They tend to be from the seedling rather than putting the seeds in there. But now I know what root trainers are. I'll try that. Thank you.
Yeah. They're quite space saving, the root trainers.
Yes.
If you haven't got much space, because they're not round, they're square.
Yeah.
You can kind of jam a lot of them into one area. So if you've got a lack of space, that's another reason to have them.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question. Belly Funky. You have a question?
Sorry, my name's Donna, but I can't change it. And I think my kids have been playing with that.
We prefer we prefer the nom de plume. Actually, it's a brilliant nom de plume.
Yes, I just wanted to know what anyone thought about sycamore because I love them, but I've had mixed, people telling me mixed things about sycamore. Thank you.
Sandra, do you want to have a go, and then I'll have a go, or do you want me to go first?
We're not doing them at the moment, just because there seems to be lots of different views about it. Some people are saying it would be a good replacement for ash because it colonizes really easily on poor soils, poor sites, but we haven't done any yet. It's very, very easy to grow them, to be fair. So if we get a green light, yes, we need some sycamore, then we'll definitely start growing them. But
so have you got a red light been issued, or is there a particular reason why you don't want to grow them? What's the main concern that you guys have been?
I mean, John would probably, I'm sure, know have a broader view on it, but we've just gleaned what we can about it, which was that, the problem with sycamore is it's not considered by a lot of people to be native. In terms of biodiversity, it's very poor. So it doesn't have the sort of variety of species that most of the other native woodland trees would have. But I think one of the main problems is it spreads really prolifically. So if you want lots and lots of sycamore, then it's good for that. But it kind of tends to take over. So unless you're managing it, then you might end up with a woodland dominated by sycamore. And having visited quite a lot of local woodlands, even ones that are owned and managed by sort of environmental organisations, you do get some woods that are totally dominated by sycamore. So, but that's just what we've managed to glean, and there might be other views on it, so that was just where we're at the moment.
So I love a sycamore, not in every place and not in every some of the finest trees in the west and the north of Scotland, in the west of Wales, out on the Irish coast are sycamores. They're cracking trees when they're, and the story goes that the first ones were planted in Scotland in 1550 to mark the alliance between the French and the Scots. And the first one was at Newbattle Abbey, apparently. It was said to be planted in Newbattle Abbey in 1550 and then fell over about 15 years ago. But there's a tree about 20 miles up the road that was 4 times as big and in girth on almost exactly the same soil. So there's a chap called Ted Green who said that sycamores are probably natives, that they should be referred to as the Celtic maple, and that everybody would think of them as in an entirely different light, and that they were wiped out in the south of east of England by the black spot fungus, the tar fungus that you get on the leaves. And there is a tomb in Christ Church College, Oxford, which was the tomb of St. I think, which has carvings of the most beautiful sycamores from 1100. Now, either the people saw them out the door, or they'd come up from Italy and knew what the sycamore looked like when they were carving the tomb in 1100. You take your money, you pay your money, you take your choice. I really like sycamore, but Sandra is right. They can over dominate. They can make it dark. So it is horses for courses. You know, pick your tree for the right spot, and it'll be fine. But I love a sycamore personally.
It's an interesting one that's been argued at more trees alongside beech as well. So native, non-native, naturalized, so forth. I'm in the same school as John on that one. I think they are incredible trees when they're mature, open grown. They're probably one of our greatest canopy species, particularly with the outgoing of elm, ash, and so forth. But we don't grow them. Part of that is because more trees' USP has been native broadleaves, and didn't want to get into this sort of argument on timescales and ice bridges. But the other thing is they do colonize exceptionally rapidly. So, you know, I don't think we're ever going to plant the number of trees we want. We also need to rely on other things like natural regeneration and create the right conditions for natural regen, and the trees will eventually make their way there. And sycamore, I'm sure, will be one of those pioneer species which will march in quite happily. So that's the reason we don't grow it. We're confident, there's plenty of it in Dartmoor. We're confident that it will deal with it itself.
Thank you for all of that. So we've got time for some more questions. Maurice.
Okay, a question and then an observation, really. The question is simply conkers. Are conkers kosher or they're not kosher?
That's a really interesting question.
I have to say, I love conkers.
Yeah, so conkers, conkers, obviously, Turkey, horse chestnut is a tree from Turkey and places down in the sort of Balkans. Introduced here, we don't know exactly when, but probably sort of 10th, 12th century, something like that, but we don't know exactly when. They obviously suffer with, they're suffering this year with, well, they're suffering for many years now with horse chestnut leaf miner, which causes the leaves to go brown. But they are beautiful trees. It's like sycamores again. It's the right tree in the right place on a village green, in a park, in a somewhere. There is nothing more beautiful than a really nice horse chestnut. So it's about proportion. I mean, the thing is that they're incredibly easy to grow from seed. So you wouldn't want to grow 50 million horse chestnuts and then plant them out, not know where you're going to put them. But you know, a few horse chestnuts here and there, I think they're lovely things. I like them. So, yeah, yes, please. I like horse chestnuts.
Okay, the observation is on a small scale, on a large scale. On a small scale, I grow conkers with my grandsons, and we found the best method is to grow them as conkers in pots, but really tightly planted. And they actually grow much better. They seem to germinate much better in something like a 200 ml pot. And we'll put 15 or 20 of them in there. Yeah. And they grow like stink. Whereas if you put a couple in the same kind of pot, they don't do so well. And the second observation is, because I'm part of a project that's growing tiny forests, which are grown really, really tightly, in the middle of a tiny forest, we've had no casualties over the summer because of drought. And it doesn't matter what species they were, because they're so tight. I mean, we've planted them about 2.5 per square meter. Next year, we're going to plant some at about 4 per square meter. And it seems that the proximity with other trees tends to mean that they shade each other, and drought has affected them very little.
And there is something very interesting going on there that we haven't truly understood about how density of trees and growth, you know, it reduces drought, reduces the possibilities of drying. We've got a project studying the formations of tiny forests. This is a really interesting new area, but the Danish have been doing work for a long time and basically say plant as many as you can in a small space, get them going, because trees don't like growing on their own. They like growing in company. you have to do is eventually assume you're going to have to fell a few of them, so that you give space for one or two left. But yeah, there was definitely something interesting there.
Oh, well, the research in the Netherlands says don't do that, and they plant up to 6 per square meter.
Eventually, though, they'll just fill up the whole meter.
Well, yeah, and that's what ancient forests were like.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting topic, and it's definitely one we're investigating at the moment as a way of dealing with some of these.
Well, come see us.
Where are you?
In Bath.
I would love to. If you can give Hilary your details, I'll be in touch and we'll see if we can come over.
Great.
One of my colleagues is specialising in that, and I'll come with her and we'll have a look. Be good fun.
Okay.
Going to say, interestingly, with the tiny forests, is one of the things we've been considering is how you can make those into very dense large forests, and the problem really comes down to overheads and costings. You know, when you cost per unit for putting those trees in. But the great thing is yes, if you plant them so densely, then you can accept a certain amount of attrition, and you don't generally have to invest highly in protection, tree shelters, fencing, and so forth. So, and I think there is something, as John was saying, what you were saying, in terms of drought tolerance, because I think they create their own microclimate being planted that close together, that they can survive very well. With the horse chestnut, I was just going to say, with regards back to the sycamore, more trees very much is just because we are native broadleaf trees planting local provenance woodland, but wholeheartedly support planting of other species, me personally as well. And it's very much what John was saying about the right tree in the right place. So if it's going into a parkland or a village green or into an area, an arboretum, or other kind of distinct sort of places like that. Street trees, for example, quite often our natives aren't great at street trees. You know, you want to look something else. So I would encourage all of you, you know, think about where you want your trees to grow, and then collect the right seed and get them going and get them in the ground. That's the most important thing. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you, Adam. Peter Asted, do you have a question, Peter?
Good evening. Yeah.
With apologies if I'm gesturing, it's because this hotel I'm staying in have just brought me an apple crumble. So this is my tea. I'm sorry, everybody, but it's getting to that stage of the evening where I'm getting hungry now.
That looks lovely.
Yeah, no, it does. I can't wait.
Yeah, firstly, thank you very much, John. Anyway, it's been really informative talk. Thank you, Sandra, as well. I was going to ask a question about mildew. I've had a bit of problem with mildew in my nursery this year, with especially on the hawthorns and the oaks. But whilst I've been sat here, I've been flicking through the tree growers guide, and it turns out that you've basically said that good nursery practice is good for that. So it's the last speaker sort of led me on to leads me back to think, well, if they're planting at such high density, does that cause more issues with pest and disease, especially with mildew? I wondered if he's had any issues with that today.
So there's something really interesting going on with mildew this year. It is we're spotting it not just in nurseries and tree growings, but in places that we haven't seen mildew, and in quantities that we haven't seen. So something about the heat of the summer, obviously going back to 76 is a long time for most of us, and there is definitely been a great growth of a particular species of mildew, which is not the same as on oak, but it's on aces, so on sycamores and on field maple. There's been a huge development of a different species of mildew this year. So there is something gone on because of the weather. We're trying to get, DEFRA and others are trying to get a handle on what's been going on with mildew, which is not quite the answer to the question you've got, but it is a universal problem that we've been seeing across the country on a range of species that we haven't seen. I don't know how it plays in the tiny forests, but it has become a major issue this year, and we don't quite know what's going on.
Do you think there's I mean, with the ban on pesticides and everyone wanting to be more ergonomic, is there any new evidence to say that some holistic treatments could be effective?
I haven't heard any, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. I don't know if anybody else does, but I haven't heard of any. Sorry.
We don't know of any specific treatment. We don't use any antifungal products or anything like that. We do get mildew. Some years it's worse than others, but what we find is when it's coming, we just try different shading and watering regimes, and we find that it sort of diminishes, and the trees then put on extra growth. So it is a bit of an experimentation really for us. We've definitely got no scientific evidence for that at all. It's just in the tree nurseries, our staff trying different things, but it's worse just some years than others, and we just accept that really as we grow our trees. Perhaps on a larger commercial in a larger commercial situation, then they can't economically do that. But I think it is really a function of climate than anything else.
Yeah, well, we'll see if they've got the term that I caught today from John, genetic plasticity. Let's see if we gain some resilience from that. Yeah. So it's a brilliant phrase. I'm going to use that one.
It's a good one. Genetic plasticity. Thank you for tea.
Chris, did you have a question?
I do, but I've got a tip first. John's pudding reminded me of it. I was harvesting crabapple today, and quite a lot were rotten, but out of 100 or so crabapple, I only got about 55 viable seeds. But we tend to open a sample of our seeds up at Special Branch, and if it's solid white, then it's more likely to be viable. A lot of seeds have got brown inside, but the crab apples, what I do, I put the pips between particularly the plumpest ones, between my finger and thumb and squeeze. And if they shoot out into the grass or under the sofa, then they're more likely to be viable. But a lot of them just flatten a bit if you press them, a bit like beech. Not quite the same, but it's quite a good idea. A lot of our volunteers just put all the brown pips in our stratification system, and they're very disappointed in the outcomes. So just put the pips between your fingers, and you can put we put it in a container so it doesn't shoot into the grass. My question is, reading the tree growers guide, I wondered why you hadn't included gorse in the pods section. You just got 3 exotics and then not the native one.
We ran out of space, and we just didn't probably think about it. Adam might have a different recollection, but it wasn't anything. It wasn't anything. We just maybe have missed it. But we can always put it in. The digital version allows us the capacity to look at those. So if you've now you've spotted it, I'm going to have to go and have a look and see if we can put it back in.
Oh yeah, well we grow it, so and it's, I suppose it's a small tree shrub, isn't it? Like the wayfaring and the other ones you've included.
Exactly.
Okay, thanks a lot.
And there are, of course, 3 gorses in Britain. There's Western gorse, dwarf gorse, and European gorse. And the Western and dwarf gorse depends where you are in the country. But if you're in the West, it's the little stuff that grows on the cliffs. If you're in the East, the little stuff is often dwarf gorse. And most people miss the fact that there are actually 3 species of gorse in Britain. But yeah, no, I can't remember why we didn't do that. If Adam does, then please speak up. But I think it was probably just one of those things.
Okay, thank you. I'm just aware of the time. We've got a few minutes left. James Graham, sorry, I didn't see your hand up earlier. Would you like to ask your question?
Hi, yes, please. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Yes.
Hi, John. Thanks
Hi.
for the talk so far, by the way. Brilliant, by the way. I have been collecting quite a lot of acorns this year. We've got a big bag full of them with the hope to plant them out. obviously springtime next year. So from a time perspective, should I be starting the stratification process now? And if I do start it now, obviously we're, beginning of October, end of September, at what point do I stop that stratification process?
I'm afraid the line broke there. So maybe Adam, I missed the question. So maybe Adam, can you pick that one up? Because I missed that entirely.
Yeah, sorry, James, just correct me if you're wrong. If I'm wrong, you're asking about the stratification of acorns.
That's right. Yeah, it's really the stratification process. Yeah, and it's just a time frame of when that's going to happen. When do I start? I've got this bag sitting here now, so do I start that stratification now? I've had success doing it before in the fridge. It was a little bit hit and miss kind of situation.
Okay. We've never ever cold stratified oak and acorns. What we do is we get like a 10-litre painter's tub, take the paint out of it, obviously, and then put all the acorns in there with a good sort of compost leaf mold mix. So it's like a forest floor, basically. The acorns are led under that, and then making sure it's moist and damp, but definitely not wet. It has a lid on it, and then it's sort of kept relatively, ambient temperature, really, outdoor temperature, and then every week we'll open it up and we'll just gently mix them up. And what we find is that the viable acorns will soon split and they'll start to throw out a radical, and then just pick them out and put them straight in a plant pot and off they go. So we've never done cold stratification. We never put them in plastic bags or anything like that. That's just how we've done them. And we also do them en masse. So we have a massive bathtub, if you will. And in that we have this kind of compost leaf mold. And then we put in layers of acorns, a bit more of this compost leaf mold over top, layers of acorns. We get 5,000 acorns easily in a bath. And then we just wait. And as soon as they come up and they've got their cotyledons going in the spring, then, they get to the first adult leaves, you can prick them out and put them on. But like I say, other than that, nothing technical.
Okay, brilliant. So it's not really down to a time span. It's really more down to the actual going through the process. And I can start that process now. And then as the process is developed, then I act and react as the chitting starts.
Yeah, that's exactly how we do it for oak. Most definitely, we'd say they're the one that I guess they are going through a point of stratification, but not as intensive as, say, a hawthorn or a cherry seed or something like that, which you might have cold shock and then heat and cold shock.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry, that's all we've actually got time for in terms of questions. Appreciate all of your questions, and sorry we couldn't get round to all of you this evening. I will be emailing you the link to the recording of this session and all other relevant links relating to the CTNC and future events as well. Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to thank John and Sandra very much for your wonderful talks and for answering the questions, and Adam as well. And yeah, have a good evening, everybody.
It's apple crumble time now, so
it's apple crumble time.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for having us. Bye.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Thank
It's lovely
you,
to meet you all.